In Lapland's brutal winter of 1695, fire wasn't enough to keep a family alive. But one herder realized the warmth he needed was already breathing in the barn. When storms carved the land into white deserts and temperatures plunged to 40 below, Aslak knew the old Goatee huts couldn't save his children. Smoke choked the rafters, frost crept through the hides, and every night felt colder than the last. But in a moment of desperation, ducking into his animal's shed during a blizzard, he discovered something astonishing. The cows were warm. The air around them was almost comfortable. That single moment sparked a revolution. Ignoring the warnings of village elders, Aslak set out to build a radical new dwelling, half dug into the earth, topped with a living grass roof and heated from below by the body heat of cows. Thick turf layers packed with roots acted as insulation. Birch bark membranes held out the meltwater. And beneath the family's floor, the animals' warmth rose through carefully built vents, turning a frozen hut into a living furnace. At first, the village mocked him. Then they envied him. And when the white wind storm struck, collapsing their old homes, Aslak's byre house stood firm, glowing with warmth in the dead of Arctic night. But survival brought new dangers: trapped heat, stagnant air, and sickness spreading among the cows. His invention would need one final breakthrough before it could save the entire community. How did Lapland herders engineer grass-roofed, animal-heated homes that defied Arctic winter and changed their world forever? Part 1. The wind, a razor from the north, swept across the tundra on October 28, 1695. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, offered little warmth. Aslak, a man in his early 40s with a face weathered by Arctic winds, stood overlooking his family's settlement. His eyes scanned the horizon. The reindeer, their coats thick and shaggy, were restless. Down below, the family's Goatee, a traditional Sámi dwelling, seemed to huddle against the earth. Its frame of birch poles was covered with layers of hides and thin turf, offering little protection against the biting cold. Inside, his wife Earthen tended to their two young children, Lars and Sophia. The thought of them, vulnerable to the encroaching winter, sent a shiver down Aslak's spine. This winter felt different. The old ones in the community whispered of a winter harsher than any in living memory. The signs were all there. The early migration of birds on September 15th, the unusual thickness of the animal's fur, the way the stars glittered with cold, hard light. Aslak, a man who trusted the wisdom of elders and the language of the land, knew they were right. He had spent summer and early autumn preparing. They had fished in the rivers, their nets heavy with salmon and trout, which now hung drying in the wind. They had gathered berries and herbs. They had reinforced the Goatee, adding another layer of hides. But Aslak knew it wouldn't be enough. The memory of the previous winter was still fresh. Even then, the cold had seeped through the walls, and Sophia had been sick for weeks, her small body racked with a cough. Aslak was a builder, a man who understood the properties of wood and stone, of earth and hide. He had built their Goatee with his own hands, following traditions passed down through generations. But now, for the first time, he questioned those traditions. The winters were growing colder, the winds more relentless. They needed something more. He walked back to the settlement, his boots crunching on frozen ground. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air. He entered the Goatee, the warmth from the small fire a welcome relief. Earthen looked up from her work, her hands busy mending a reindeer hide. Her smile was strained. "The wind is strong today," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It will be stronger tomorrow," Aslak replied, his gaze falling on Sophia, who was sleeping fitfully under a pile of furs. Her breathing was shallow, and a faint flush colored her cheeks. Aslak's heart clenched. He had to find a way to keep them warm, to keep them safe. That night, as the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, Aslak lay awake, his mind racing. He thought of the stories his grandfather had told him, stories of a time before the great reindeer herds, when the Sámi lived in dwellings dug into the earth, their roofs covered with thick layers of turf. He thought of the way snow insulated the ground, keeping the roots of trees from freezing. He thought of the cows, their bodies a source of constant warmth, their breath a cloud of steam in the cold air. An idea began to form in his mind, a radical idea that went against everything he had been taught. What if he could combine the old ways with the new? What if he could build a dwelling that was part of the earth itself, a dwelling that used the warmth of animals to heat the living space? It was a crazy idea, a dangerous idea. But as he looked at his sleeping daughter, her small face pale in the flickering firelight, he knew he had to try. The next morning, October 29th, he shared his idea with Elin. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When he had finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she reached out and took his hand. "It is a risk," she said, her voice steady. "But we are a people who have always taken risks. We have survived in this harsh land because we are not afraid to change, to adapt. If you believe this will keep our children safe, then I believe in you." Her words gave him the strength he needed. He would build a new kind of home, a home that would defy the winter. He would build a home with a roof of grass and walls of earth, a home warmed by the breath of cows. Aslak began his work immediately on October 30th, 1695. He chose a site on a gentle slope protected from the north wind by a stand of birch trees. He spent days digging into the earth, his muscles aching, his hands raw. He laid a foundation of stones, carefully chosen for their size and shape. He built a frame of sturdy birch poles, their white bark a stark contrast to the dark earth. He was building a fortress against the coming winter. His work did not go unnoticed. The other members of the community watched him with curiosity and skepticism. Some of the elders shook their heads. They had seen men with new ideas before, men who had challenged the old ways and paid the price. "You are wasting your time, Aslak," one of the elders, a man named Kale, told him on November 2nd. "The old ways have served us well for centuries. Your newfangled ideas will bring only ruin." Aslak listened respectfully, but he was not swayed. He knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. He was fighting for his family's survival. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, Aslak's work became more urgent. He worked from dawn until dusk. He built a separate section for the cows, their body heat a crucial part of his design. Each cow, he knew, could produce approximately 3,500 to 4,000 BTU per hour, enough warmth to make a significant difference. He built a thick roof of birch bark, layer upon layer, a waterproof barrier against the snow and rain. The birch bark, harvested in spring when the sap was running, was strong, water-resistant, and could last 30 years. Then he began to add the turf. He had chosen the turf carefully on November 5th, cutting it from a nearby meadow where the grass grew thick and deep. The grass species included Festuca ovina, sheep fescue, known for its deep root system and drought tolerance. He laid it in 2 layers, the first with the grass facing down to serve as drainage, the second with the grass facing up. The roots, he knew, would eventually intertwine, creating a solid, insulating mass. The roof, when he was finished, was almost a meter thick, weighing approximately 250 kilograms per square meter, a living, breathing part of the earth itself. By the time the first snows of winter began to fall on November 8, 1695, the new dwelling was complete. It was a strange-looking structure, half buried in the earth, its roof a carpet of green and brown. It looked more like a hill than a house. The other members of the community gathered to look at it, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. "It is a tomb," Kyle muttered, his voice full of scorn. "You have built a tomb for your family." Aslak ignored him. He knew the real test was yet to come. The winter, with its icy breath and relentless fury, would be the ultimate judge of his creation. He moved his family into the new dwelling on November 9th. The cows were moved into their new quarters, their lowing a comforting sound in the quiet of the new home. That night, as the first blizzard of the winter raged outside, Aslak and his family sat around the fire in their new home. The wind howled, but inside it was quiet. The cold, which had always been a constant companion in their old Gowati, was gone. The air was warm, almost balmy, heated by the fire and the gentle warmth of the cows in the next room. Sophia, who had been coughing for weeks, was breathing easily, her sleep deep and peaceful. Aslak looked at Elin, her face illuminated by the firelight. Her eyes were shining with tears. "You did it, Aslak," she whispered. "You did it." Aslak nodded, a lump in his throat. He had built a home that could withstand the winter. He had built a home that would keep his family safe. But he knew this was just the beginning. The winter had only just begun, and it would test his creation in ways he could not yet imagine. Part 2. The first weeks of winter passed in a blur of snow and wind. The polar night, or Kamos, descended on December 12, 1695, plunging the world into darkness that would last until mid-January. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, but inside Aslak's new home, it was a haven of warmth and light. The turf roof, now covered with thick snow, provided an almost impenetrable barrier against the cold. Word of Aslak's success spread quickly. The other families, huddled in their cold Goatis, watched with jealousy and admiration. They saw Aslak's children playing outside on December 20th, their cheeks rosy, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence of the winter landscape. They saw the smoke rising from the chimney, a sign of the warmth within. One by one they came to him on December 22nd, their faces etched with worry, their voices full of desperate hope. They asked him questions, their skepticism replaced by grudging respect. Aslak, a man who had always been an outsider, found himself in the unfamiliar role of a leader, a teacher. He showed them the plans he had drawn on birch bark on December 28th, his designs a marvel of ingenuity. He explained the principles of insulation, of how earth and snow could trap heat. He showed them how he had built the separate section for the cows, how their body heat was channeled into the living space through vents. He explained how the turf roof changed with the seasons. He took them to the meadow on January 5th, 1696, where he had cut the turf. He explained the importance of the grass, how its deep roots held the soil together, creating a dense, insulating mat. He showed them the different types of grass, the fescues and the bents. He explained how the first layer of turf, laid with the grass facing down, created a drainage system. He explained how the second layer, with the grass facing up, created a living roof. He showed them the birch bark on January 10th. He explained how he had harvested it in spring, when the sap was running, how he had carefully peeled it from the trees. He showed them how he had laid it in layers, each one overlapping the next, creating a waterproof barrier. He explained that 6 layers were considered adequate, though up to 16 layers could be used for high-quality roofs. He showed them the stones on January 12th, each one chosen for its size and shape. He explained how the stones provided a solid base for the dwelling. He showed them the birch poles he had used for the frame. He showed them everything on January 14th, holding nothing back. He believed that knowledge should be shared. Kyle, the elder who had been his most vocal critic, was the last to come to him on January 18th, 1696. He came one evening, his face a mask of pride and humility. He stood at the entrance to Aslak's home, his eyes taking in the warmth and comfort within. He did not speak for a long time. Then he looked at Aslak, his eyes full of grudging respect. "You were right, Aslak," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right, and I was wrong. I am an old man, and I am set in my ways. I was afraid of change, afraid of the unknown. But you have shown me that there is a better way. You have shown me that we can survive, that we can thrive, even in this harsh land." Aslak nodded, a lump in his throat. Kyle's words were a validation of everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in. He had not just built a home, he had built a future for his people. The winter of 1696 was a turning point for the community. Under Aslak's guidance, they began to build new homes, homes that were modeled on his design. They worked together, their hands and hearts united in a common purpose. They dug into the earth, they laid the stones, they raised the birch poles, they harvested the birch bark, they cut the turf, they built the roofs. They worked with feverish energy, their bodies fueled by a new sense of hope, a new sense of possibility. Aslak was their teacher, their guide, their inspiration. He moved from one construction site to another on February 14th, 1696, his presence a source of comfort and encouragement. He answered their questions, he solved their problems, he shared his knowledge freely. He was a patient teacher who understood that learning was a process. By October 25th, 1696, the community had been transformed. A dozen new homes, their turf roofs, a patchwork of green and brown, dotted the landscape. They were a testament to the community's resilience, their ingenuity, their will to survive. The winter of 1696-1697 was even harsher. The temperatures plummeted to record lows of -45 degrees Celsius on January 8, 1697, and the snow fell in a relentless blanket. The wind howled like a hungry wolf. But inside their new homes, the families were warm and safe. The turf roofs, now covered with thick snow, weighing up to 500 kilograms per square meter, provided almost perfect insulation. The children, who had once been pale and sickly, were now healthy and strong. Their laughter echoed in the warm homes on February 2nd, 1697, a sound of defiance against the winter's fury. The elders, who had once been filled with doom, were now filled with hope. They sat by the fire and told stories of the old days. But now their stories had a new ending, an ending that spoke of a future that was bright and full of promise. Aslak, the man who had once been an outsider, was now the heart of the community on February 10th, 1697. He was their leader, their hero, their savior. He had not just saved them from the winter, he had saved them from themselves. But Aslak was not a man who rested on his laurels. He knew that there was always more to learn. He spent the long winter nights on February 20th, 1697, studying the plans he had drawn on birch bark, looking for ways to improve his design. He experimented with different types of turf, different types of grass. He was a man driven by relentless curiosity. He knew that the winter was not their only enemy. There were other dangers. There were the wolves, their howls a constant reminder of the wildness of the land. There were the diseases, the fevers, and the coughs that could sweep through the community. There was the ever-present threat of starvation. But Aslak was not a man who was easily discouraged. He was a man of action. He organized the men into hunting parties on March 3rd, 1697, their spears and bows a formidable defense against the wolves. He taught the women on March 8th how to use herbs and berries to make medicines. He taught the children on March 15th how to read the tracks of animals, how to find food in the frozen landscape. And as the winter of 1697 began to loosen its grip on April 12th, as the days grew longer and the sun began to regain its strength. On April 18th, Aslak stood on the rise overlooking his community, his heart full of quiet pride. The turf roofs, now beginning to show patches of green on April 25th, were a symbol of their survival, a symbol of their triumph. They had faced the winter, and they had won. Part 3. The winter of 1698 began with deceptive mildness. The first snows arrived late on November 10th, and the winds were gentle whispers compared to the roaring gales of previous years. A sense of complacency settled over the community. Their new homes, the byre dwellings, had proven their worth. The turf roofs were thick and lush, the walls solid and comforting. The cows, their numbers now increased, were a constant source of warmth and life. But the Arctic is a land of extremes, a land that does not tolerate complacency. In mid-December, on December 15th, 1698, the temperature plummeted with sudden, brutal ferocity. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, became a raging beast, its howl a symphony of destruction. The snow fell in a blinding, suffocating torrent, burying the world in a blanket of white. The community retreated into their homes, their confidence unshaken. They had faced the winter before, and they had won. They had no reason to believe this year would be any different. But this year, the enemy was not the cold. It was something far more insidious, something that came from within. It started with a single cow on December 18th in the home of a man named Lars, a young herder who had been one of Aslak's most enthusiastic followers. The cow, a healthy, robust animal, suddenly became listless. It refused to eat, its eyes were dull, and its breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Its body, once a furnace of heat, was now barely warm. Lars, a man who knew his animals as well as he knew his own children, was filled with dread. He went to Aslak on December 19th, his face a mask of worry. Aslak came to Lars's home, his brow furrowed in concentration. He examined the cow, his hands gentle, his eyes missing nothing. He could find no sign of injury, no sign of disease, but he could feel the life draining out of the animal, a slow, inexorable ebbing of the vital spark. He recommended a poultice of herbs, a traditional remedy for animal sickness. He recommended isolating the cow from the others, a precaution against the spread of disease. But his words lacked their usual conviction. He was a builder, a man of wood and stone. He was not a healer, a man of herbs and potions. He felt a sense of helplessness. His remedies were useless. The cow died 2 days later on December 22nd, its body a cold, stiff monument to his failure. Lars was devastated. The loss of the cow was a blow to his livelihood, but it was more than that. It was a crack in the foundation of their new world. And then another cow fell sick on December 24th in another home, and then another on December 26th. The sickness spread through the community like a wildfire, a silent, invisible plague. The symptoms were always the same: the listlessness, the loss of appetite, the shallow breathing, the slow, inexorable draining of life. The cows, the source of their warmth, the source of their survival, were dying. Panic began to set in. The new homes, once a symbol of their salvation, now felt like a trap. The warmth, which had been a source of comfort, now felt like a curse. The very air they breathed, the air that was heated by the breath of the dying animals, felt thick with the stench of death. The community turned on Aslak on December 28th. The admiration, the respect, the gratitude, all of it evaporated in a cloud of fear and anger. They came to him, their faces a mixture of accusation and despair. They had trusted him, they had followed him, and he had led them to their doom. "You and your new ideas!" a woman shrieked, her voice raw with grief. Her family had lost 2 cows in as many days. "You have brought this curse upon us. We were safe in our goatis, we were safe with the old ways. You have tied our fate to the fate of our animals, and now we will all die together." Kael, the elder who had once been his most vocal critic and then his most ardent supporter, was now his most formidable opponent. He stood before Aslak on December 29th, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. He had believed in Aslak, he had trusted him, and now he felt betrayed. "I warned you, Aslak," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his years. "I warned you that the old ways were not to be trifled with. We have survived in this land for centuries because we have respected the balance of nature. You have upset that balance. You have brought the animals into our homes, and you have brought their diseases with them. We have traded the cold for the plague, and we are no better off than we were before." Aslak listened to their accusations, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He was racked with guilt, with a sense of responsibility that was almost unbearable. He had wanted to save his people, and he had led them to the brink of disaster. But he was not a man who was easily defeated. He was a man of action, a man of solutions. He would not let his people die. He would not let his dream die. He would find a way to save them. He began a frantic investigation on December 30th, his mind a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. He inspected the byres, the living quarters, the fodder. He talked to the families, his questions sharp and precise. He was looking for a pattern, a clue, a key that would unlock the mystery of the dying cows. He spent days and nights in the byres, his senses on high alert. He watched the cows, he listened to their breathing, he felt the warmth of their bodies. He noticed that the air in the byres was thick and heavy, that the walls were damp with condensation. He noticed that the sickest cows were in the most tightly sealed byres, the byres that were the warmest, the byres that were the most prized. And then, on January 3rd, 1699, he understood. The problem was not the cows. The problem was the air. The very thing that was supposed to be saving them, the warmth, was also killing them. The byres were too well sealed, the ventilation insufficient. The air, thick with the breath of the animals, was becoming stale, humid, a breeding ground for disease. The warmth, which had been a blessing, had become a curse. He had been so focused on trapping the heat, on keeping the cold out, that he had forgotten the importance of fresh air. He had forgotten that all living things, humans and animals alike, need to breathe. He had created a perfect incubator for disease, a perfect death trap. He went to the community on January 4th, his face grim, his voice steady. He explained his discovery, his theory. He told them that they had to increase the ventilation, that they had to let some of the warm air escape, that they had to let the fresh, cold air in. His words were met with a storm of protest. They were already cold, their homes already losing warmth as the cows died, and he wanted them to let more cold in? It was madness. It was suicide. "You are a fool, Aslak," a man shouted on January 5th, his voice trembling with rage. "You will kill us all." "We are already dying," Aslak replied, his voice ringing with desperate conviction. "Our animals are dying, and we will be next. We have to take this risk. It is our only hope." A heated debate ensued, a battle of wills between the old ways and the new, between fear and hope, between despair and survival. The community was divided, their loyalties torn. They had trusted Aslak once, and he had led them to the brink of disaster. Could they trust him again? In the end, it was Elin who turned the tide on January 6th. She stood before the community, her voice clear and strong. "I trust my husband," she said, her eyes meeting the gaze of every man and woman in the room. "I have always trusted him, and I will trust him now. We will do as he says. We will take this risk, and we will survive." Her words, spoken with such simple, unwavering conviction, had a powerful effect. One by one, the families began to agree. They would trust Aslak one more time. They would put their lives, and the lives of their children, in his hands. That night, on January 6, 1699, under a sky that was a cold, hard sheet of black, they began to modify the vents in their homes. They worked in a grim, determined silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their torches. They were a community on the brink, a community that was gambling everything on a single, desperate hope. Aslak worked alongside them, his hands and his heart united in a common purpose. He showed them how to widen the vents, how to create a cross breeze that would carry the stale air out and the fresh air in. He showed them how to do it without losing too much heat, how to find the delicate balance between warmth and ventilation. By the time they were finished, the night was almost over. They retreated into their homes, their hearts full of nervous anticipation. They had done what Aslak had asked. They had taken the risk. Now, all they could do was wait. Part 4. The first light of dawn on January 7, 1699, brought no relief. The cold that had seeped into Aslak's home was a palpable thing, a physical presence that clung to the walls and the furs. Sophia's cough had worsened through the night, a relentless, hacking sound that tore at Aslak's soul. He had failed. He had gambled with the lives of his family, his people, and he had lost. He could hear the murmurs from the other homes, the sounds of fear and anger that were all too familiar. He could imagine their faces, their eyes full of accusation. He had promised them salvation, and he had delivered them a colder, more certain death. He waited for the inevitable, for the moment when they would come for him, their faces contorted with rage. But the moment never came. Instead, a different sound broke the morning silence. It was a shout, a cry of disbelief, of wonder. It came from the home of Lars, the young herder whose cow had been the first to die. Aslak rushed outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He expected to see a mob, a pyre, a final terrible judgment. He saw Lars, his face a mask of astonishment, pointing at his buyer. "Look!" Lars shouted, his voice trembling. "Look at the cow!" Aslak pushed his way through the small crowd that had gathered. He looked into the byre, and his breath caught in his throat. The cow that had been on the brink of death, the cow that had been listless and unresponsive for days, was standing. It was unsteady. On its feet, its body thin and gaunt, but it was standing, and it was eating. It was nibbling at a handful of hay. Its eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, now held a faint spark of life. It was a miracle. It was impossible, but it was happening. Aslak moved from one home to another, his heart a wild drum in his chest. The story was the same everywhere. The cows that had been sick, the cows that had been on the verge of death, were showing signs of recovery. They were standing, they were eating, they were breathing. The air in the byres, which had been thick with the stench of death, was now fresh and clean. The dampness on the walls was gone, replaced by a dry, healthy coolness. The community looked at Aslak, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had been right. He had been right all along. The cold, fresh air, which they had feared as an enemy, was their savior. It had purged the sickness from their homes. It had brought their animals back from the brink of death. Kael, the elder, stood before Aslak on January 8th, his face a study in humility. He did not speak. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of respect, of apology, of gratitude. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, a gesture that acknowledged the wisdom of the man he had so recently condemned. Aslak had not just saved their animals. He had saved them. He had saved their homes, their way of life, their future. He had shown them that survival was not just about holding on to the old ways, but about having the courage to embrace the new. He had shown them that true wisdom was not about being right, but about being willing to be wrong, about being willing to learn, about being willing to adapt. The crisis of the winter of 1698-1699 was a harsh but valuable lesson. It taught them that their new homes, their byre dwellings, were not perfect. They were a work in progress, a living, breathing entity that needed to be understood, to be respected, to be managed. They learned that the balance between warmth and ventilation was a delicate one, a dance between the heat of the animals and the cold of the winter. Under Aslak's guidance on January 15, 1699, they refined the design of their homes. They developed a system of adjustable vents, a way to control the flow of air, to fine-tune the temperature, to create a healthy, comfortable living environment for both humans and animals. They learned to read the signs, to listen to the language of their homes, to respond to the changing needs of the seasons. They became masters of their environment, not just survivors. They became a community that was not just resilient, but innovative, a community that was not just strong, but wise. They had faced the ultimate test, and they had emerged victorious. As the winter began to recede on March 20th, 1699, as the days grew longer and the sun began to warm the earth, a new sense of hope, a new sense of confidence settled over the community. They had faced the worst that the winter could throw at them, and they had survived. They had faced their own fears, their own doubts, their own prejudices, and they had overcome them. Aslak, the man who had once been an outsider, was now their undisputed leader. But he was a different kind of leader, a leader who led not by command, but by example, a leader who inspired not by fear, but by hope. He stood on the rise overlooking his community, his heart full of quiet satisfaction. The turf roofs, now a vibrant green, were a symbol of their resilience, a symbol of their renewal. The smoke rising from the chimneys was a symbol of their warmth, their comfort, their security. The laughter of the children was now a constant, joyful melody. They had not just survived the winter, they had conquered it. Part 5. The years that followed were a testament to the community's resilience and Aslak's vision. The byre dwellings, once a radical experiment, became the standard, their green roofs a defining feature of the landscape. The knowledge was passed down, from parent to child, from builder to apprentice. The bitter lessons of the winter of 1699 were not forgotten. They were woven into the fabric of their building traditions. By 1715, Aslak was a man in his 60s, his hair the color of winter snow, his face a map of a life lived in the harsh but beautiful embrace of the Arctic. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an elder, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of one who has seen both triumph and despair. The community he had led from the brink of extinction was now a thriving settlement of over 20 families, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The world outside had been thrown into turmoil. The Great Northern War had raged for over a decade, a conflict that had redrawn the map of Europe. News of the war reached them in fragments, carried by traders and travelers. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 would eventually cede parts of Lapland to Russia, a political decision made in a distant capital that would have profound consequences for the Sámi people. But for now, in their small, isolated community, they were shielded from the worst of the storm. Their byre dwellings, their self-sufficiency, their strong sense of community, all of it had created a buffer, a sanctuary in a world gone mad. One summer afternoon in July 1718, a visitor arrived. He was a young man from the south, a student from the University of Uppsala, his face full of eager curiosity. He had come to study the Sámi, to document their ways. He had expected to find a primitive people, a people living on the edge of survival. He found instead a community that was prosperous, a people who were masters of their environment. He was fascinated by the byre dwellings, by their simple but ingenious design. He spent days with Aslak, his notebook filled with sketches and notes. He measured the thickness of the turf roofs. He calculated the angle of the walls. He documented the system of vents. He was a man of science, a man of reason, and he was in awe of the practical wisdom of this self-taught builder. "You have created a masterpiece of engineering," he told Aslak on July 25, 1718, his voice full of admiration. "Your homes are a perfect example of how to live in harmony with nature. They are warm in the winter, cool in the summer. They are built from the earth, and they will one day return to the earth. They are a lesson that we in the South have forgotten." Aslak listened to the young man's words, a faint smile on his lips. He had not thought of his work in such grand terms. He had simply been a man trying to keep his family safe. But he knew that the young man was right. They had created something special, something that was worth preserving, something that was worth sharing. The young man's visit was a turning point. It was the first time that the outside world had taken an interest in their community, not as a source of taxes or converts, but as a source of knowledge, of wisdom. The young man's notes and sketches would eventually be published in 1722, his account of the byre dwellings a source of fascination and inspiration for architects and builders for generations to come. Aslak lived to see his grandchildren born in the warm, safe homes he had built. He saw them grow up healthy and strong, their laughter a constant reminder of the legacy he had created. He saw his son, Lars, become a leader in his own right, a man who carried on his father's work with quiet, steady determination. He saw his daughter, Sophia, the child whose cough had been the catalyst for his innovation, become a healer, a woman who used herbs and berries to keep her people healthy. He died peacefully in the winter of 1732 on February 3rd, in the home he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the love of his family. He was buried in the earth he had loved, under a sky that was a cold, hard sheet of stars. His life had been a testament to the power of a single idea, the power of a single individual to change the world. The byre dwellings, the grass roofs, the cow heat, all of it became a part of the Sámi heritage, a symbol of their resilience, their ingenuity, their will to survive. The design was adapted and modified over the years, but the basic principles remained the same. The homes became a part of the landscape, a part of the culture, a part of the soul of the people. And so, the story of Aslak, the builder, the innovator, the leader, became a legend, a story told around the fire on long winter nights, a story of a man who had dared to dream of a better world, a man who had dared to build it. It was a story of survival, a story of hope, a story of the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of the harshest of adversities.